Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dave Thomas. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Bales & Associates, and I want to thank you for joining today's Beginner's Guides to IPA's webinar. It's an encore presentation of a session we did earlier that got a lot of good feedback, so we wanted to share it with everybody again. Before we get started, and if you're not familiar with Bales, I want to take a second and just give you a brief overview of our organization. We've been in the Infor ecosystem for over 26 years, and we are entirely Infor focused. We do nothing but Infor implementations, upgrades, managed services, and we support all aspects of the technology, including S3, Landmark, and Cloud Suite, the HCM, Finance, and Supply Chain suites. In fact, we have been recognized and given partnering awards in 8 out of the last 10 years, and our consultants bring 15 plus years of consulting experience in the space with equivalent and professional experience. Some are former benefits managers, compensation managers, directors of supply chain, as well as former controllers and CFOs. In 2020, we were recognized by KLAS, which is a healthcare consulting organization, ranking agency, as top of class, which means we were ranked across our peers in the industry by our customers as the best partner to work with when it comes to implementing Infor solutions. We were really excited about that and happy to share that with our customers. Some additional exciting news this year. On February 1st, Bales became part of Nordic Consulting. Nordic is an industry-leading healthcare consulting firm. We'll continue to operate as a wholly owned subsidiary and be led by Jamie Bales as president. Nordic will provide us with resources to fund our growth, expand our business, and support our customers more effectively, both healthcare and other industries as well. For healthcare customers, it allows us to bring together the Nordic capabilities in the EHR space to provide a more holistic solution, including specific expertise in EHR and ERP integration. This combination will offer a best practices model to reduce implementation risks and leverage the data from both systems to drive insights and outcomes. Again, thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us, and I'm going to turn it over to the presenters.
Everybody, good morning, good afternoon. Thanks, Dave. My name is Jared Brock. With me today is Robert Schmidt, and we are going to be your tour guides here as we talk about what we think is the wonderful world of IPA. This is part one of a series of Beginner's Guide to IPA webinars that we have done. I would definitely suggest checking parts 2 and 3 out. They're on our YouTube. There's a lot of good information there. This is being part one. This really is the introduction. The audience here, the target audience really is maybe project leaders, business leaders, managers, anybody looking at that kind of 30,000 foot design level of their product suite and thinking about maybe how can we integrate IPA or what even is it? Is it something we can use? And if so, how can we use it? So we're gonna touch on a lot of those high level things. We're not gonna get into kind of the nitty gritty of the development pieces here, but we're gonna introduce you to all the different parts of IPA, how it kind of fits into your system, and then do a quick walkthrough to sort of demonstrate, how this might work for you. And we'll certainly save some time for questions at the end, so please don't be bashful. We should have plenty of discussion time. With that, I will turn it over to Robert.
Thank you, Jared. I appreciate it. And for those who don't fit in those categories, please feel free to stay on and listen. We hope that you enjoy the information, and if it's even just refresher information, we do what we can and to please and entertain while we're on here as well. So. The bigger question, what is IPA? IPA, Infor Process Automation is what IPA stands for. So Infor Process Automation is, it's one of our probably highly utilized workflow application tools. It does work across the entire Landmark runtime platform, which we're going to get a bit more into in a minute. But what do we use it for? We're using IPA to do automations. We're using it to help automate some of our controls. So if we want it to go to some sort of approval, or if we want to control or have a look at data elements within the system in order to make sure that we're processing correctly, And then in addition to automating and, utilizing some of those controls, it gives us the ability to do some measures on that workflow processing, potentially see where bottlenecks are, or, see how often or, how many times per day, week, month, we're utilizing that. So in essence, it's a pretty widely spread utilized tool, and we can use it in and of itself, but we can also tie into other applications or other pieces within the application, being like a replication set, or potentially even a file creation utility, or even the tools that we have available. So it's not just kind of a standalone piece by itself. And then as far as the workflows, so if we think of an end-to-end consistent process, so if I have these 10 steps that I'm manually walking through or partially manually walking through each day, if I had a way to take those 10 consistent steps and put them in an automation tool, I can then take the time that that person is doing those steps and have them work on something else and have the system work for me. So in essence, I'm utilizing the system to be a bit more efficient and automating those pieces that I'm having people work on. And I have the ability to control what's happening within the workflow itself. It does help from a budgeting perspective in order to have them work on other things. And it also increases their knowledge and our resources, our employees' knowledge as well. So the workflows in and of themselves do allow me to do some multi-step or multi-level related approvals. So given an example of if I wanted to potentially hire someone and I knew I needed 3 levels of approvals, I didn't have to have someone send an email or an office mail or walk to that person or email that person to get the approvals. I can set up that multi-tier approval in the workflow itself, and I can allow the system to then forward work to the appropriate person, and it'll be in their inbox for them to manage it within the single system. So if they need to look at information and do the approval, it all stays directly into the system itself. And all of this is built directly into core functionality. There isn't a whole bunch of work I have to do to get these pieces to work. It's built within the system itself. So I want to provide maybe 2 examples, which are pretty large or widely used examples. So if I have a hire process, so if I have an HR generalist that is identified a person that they want to hire, but they then want that person into the system as an employee, those steps that they walk through in order to put the information together, send that off for multi-level approval, and then get them added and then send notifications are prime examples of a workflow that I can put into the system and utilize baked-in functionality that exists as part of my implementation. My second example, which I know a lot of people have, is requisition approvals, right? So I'm putting in a requisition. I know based off of the department that I'm going into, I know based off of the dollar amount that's on that requisition, it needs to go to any number level of approvals to fit that and allow that to then go to a buyer for being purchased. So just kind of using 2 examples of how we can automate those processes, use the system to our advantage, and allow us the ability to do that processing consistently and efficiently for our organization. And then just for those who have been in the Infor ecosystem for a period of time, you may hear a couple other terms. I just want to throw them out there. You may hear things of workflow, process flow. You may hear process flow integrator, process automations. These are all similar reflecting items that tie us to Infor Process Automation in the V11 environment.
And while we're talking about all the things that IPA is, we can't leave the opportunity for a good corny joke about what IPA isn't. So this comes up pretty much every call when Robert and I are talking to new clients about leveraging IPA. It's not a beer, not a beer.
And then, we talk about IPA, and we talk about how it's used, and we talk about where the areas that we can utilize it with, and what data can we have. But what is it really built on? So there's an idea of IPA built on, and it's called business process modeling. And the business process modeling here is kind of a graphical representation of what, from your business perspective, you may not even realize innately that you are doing this, but generally speaking, we do this a lot within our different processes, within the workflows and those kind of business designs that we do. So we have to design out the process, right? What does it look like? Who does it need to flow to? Where are our potential points that we need to go to when we're going through that? And then we then model it, right? So we then look at each of the different steps within there, each of the different use cases we have, and where does our business process fall and route as part of that total end-to-end process, model what that looks like. And then we move into and implement and execute. So we then have to code, in essence. We have to put together what those steps look like within the designer tool in order for us to have the start to finish, taking into account how things are triggered. You know, who do we notify? What different pieces do we need to send to whoever in order to get that approval done? There's just lots of different scenarios, and that's part of the design and model to come up with those. We then put them together into a single solution or potentially one or more solutions. And then we want to put that in place, right? So we're going to test in some sort of test or train or dev environment, right? We're going to get formal sign off and move it into our production. Excuse me. And then once we're in our production, this is running, right? So our end users are hiring, our end users are putting in requisitions, they're transferring, they're pay rate changing, they're doing all of these functions that we have within our workflows. So once it's running and we've implemented that, then we're going to monitor it. We're going to see if we have any sort of errors. You know, we're going to look at if there's a bottleneck somewhere in there, somewhere we can improve our own existing process. And then we move into that optimization. So when we realize that there are errors, or we realize that, you know, we could do this slightly different, that would increase our efficiency and reduce the amount of time it takes to, let's say, hire someone, we're going to do it again, right? We're going to design based off the optimization of an existing process, and we're going to go through that continually. And we're going to do that as we work through each of our different workflows, each of our different business processes. So you may not realize innately we're doing this today as it comes to looking at our processes that we have in place and what are the items that we can automate. So if it is a consistent process, if it's done, you know, these X number of steps are done the same way every single time, it allows us that ability to have the system work for us. And we can look to see how do we bypass our pitfalls and bottlenecks. So we are getting pieces today where maybe it's taking too long in a certain area. Maybe if it hits that area and it's more than 48 hours, we need to escalate it. The system does that for us, and we just need to identify what those are and how do we take care and handle those specifically. And then we can have a couple different interactions. We can have a system-to-system interaction. So this could be internal within Infor itself. This could be external to maybe a different timekeeping system or maybe a benefit system. We can have people to system, so we can have this triggered by a person. We can have a person interacting, and then we can even do people to people, where if we have some sort of, you know, process where it's, I need to do something, but I need the system to gather information and then send it to someone else. All of these fall within that business process modeling. And then from a control perspective, you know, we want to look and see what kind of control do we have in place. Is this that we need someone to look at it before it's assigned to the system? Do we need someone to review specific data elements? Do we need to look to see if this goes against our budget? Does it use the supervisor structure that's in there? Does it use some sort of other structure that's in there? The business process modeling in IPA allows us the ability to process on this model and work through what those automations look like.
And I think a lot of people will look at this BPM kind of flow and think, okay, well, sure, this is a workflow engine. Yeah, that makes sense. That's how it would go. We design a thing and build it and put it in there and watch it run. And that's all true. But I think one of the places that IPA really shines now is in these last couple phases here, especially monitor and continual optimization. The tools that are in the product now that let us not only see what is running currently or what's scheduled to run or what's about to kick off or what just finished, but it lets us dig into all of the metrics associated with how things are running. And then with those metrics, we can kind of manage that, right? We can see, hey, we've got this particular type of flow that's taking a really long time, or it's taking longer than we think, or it always gets hung up because it takes a little bit too long, or it always fails in this same spot, maybe something like that. It's really easy for us to see those things. And because we can see them, because we can measure them, it's easy for us to figure out, okay, how can we make this a little bit better? And so I think for folks that are new to IPA, it makes a lot of sense to start with the things that you can manage, start with some simple flows. But as you get more familiarity with the toolkit and you get more used to managing these and keeping an eye on the metrics and things like that, you really can have some really complex flows running in IPA because you've got all these tools to keep an eye on it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just a set it and forget it kind of mindset. But this whole top to bottom tool set really gives you everything you need to have some really complex flows in there. And I mean, we see that. We see that a lot. We see that with some of the hiring. Robert mentioned like requisitions. We certainly see it there. Really, really complex flows involving a lot of different things. But with the toolkit, it's not so complex. Managing it isn't so complex. So it's really powerful. So let's talk a little bit about the big picture and kind of how IPA fits into this Infor product suite. So Robert mentioned a little bit earlier too that one of the names some folks might be familiar with is old process flow or process flow integrator or something like that. And that's because way back in the day, Lawson V9, V10, process IPA was called process flow, and it lived over in that Lawson System Foundation application and environment. But when Lawson and Infor moved into what was called V11 for a long time, the landmark runtime environment, that's a much more powerful architecture, allows us to do a lot more. And so Infor recognized early on there might be a lot more power in moving IPA into that landmark runtime environment instead. And so in V11, and this is true whether you're on premise or you're in the cloud, IPA lives in your landmark runtime environment alongside applications like GHR or FSM, CSF, things like that. Um, and even though it lives in Landmark and it's kind of run as part of Landmark, it can still go out and talk to any of your other Infor Product Suite products. So that might be Lawson System Foundation, might be S3, whether that's V9 or V10, might be something like Workforce Management, might be something completely different that's kind of out of the, what we would call the legacy Lawson space, maybe something like Sightline or something like that. But IPA can also access completely external vendors. There's some different nodes that let us transmit files or make web service calls across firewalls and DMZs out to third-party vendors and third-party applications. So um, there's a lot of flexibility in how we can use it, and we tend to look at it in one of two ways because of where it lives in this product suite. It can be that workflow engine. It can just automate those business tasks. Like Robert said, sometimes we have these things where we've got 5 steps, 10 steps that we just do repetitively all the time. That's really easy to make a workflow automation out of that and get that off of somebody's desk. But because IPA can go reach out to all these other systems and integrate them with the activities inside IPA, it becomes a really powerful integration engine as well. And then, of course, if we can combine the integration engine and the workflow engine, there's a lot of stuff we can do in there, right? So it's positioned in this architecture now. It's kind of in the perfect spot to be able to do a little bit of everything, both internal to the landmark applications, internal to the other Infor products that you might have in your product suite, and then external to any of these other third-party vendors that you might want to bring into your Infor product suite.
to that, Jared.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, just real quick. So, and we're talking about, integration, working within the Landmark runtime environment. I mean, we're talking about creating records, we're updating records, we're talking about finding records. So we're not just in essence, working along the lines of just, I can get this piece of information, I can send it to someone else. I can get information, and based off that information, I could update someone's benefits. I can update their mailing address. I can do some of those things. And there's a pretty large list of my connections I can make to this. So I can do stuff via SFTP, JDBC, JMS. I can do, web API calls. There is a lot of, different, tie-in pieces that can be made to IPA in and of itself, both inbound and outbound.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and a little bit of that bears repeating, I think. The fact that IPA is built into this Landmark environment. We're talking about a built-in toolkit. This is not, some additional license. This is not a different product you could implement if you wanted to. This is shipped. This is shipped with Landmark. It's shipped in V11. Whether you've got GHR or FSM, CSF, or both, you've got IPA. It's there. It's already running in the background. You don't need to do anything to set it up. It's already there. And because it's built right into that environment, it can get at that application data really easily and really efficiently. So, yeah, just like Robert said, we can make changes to data records in there. We can kick off services that are native to the applications. And we can do that really, really quickly because the IPA processes are running right alongside the application processes. So it can be really efficient when done well. So let's break down what is kind of in that IPA bucket there. So, we know this whole IPA service is kind of running in your Landmark environment, but there's a couple different pieces that make up IPA. So the one you'll probably see most often is the process server administrator. And this is an application module, just like any of the application modules that might be in GHR or CSF. So, maybe that's something like benefits, or maybe that's something like accounts payable. The process server administrator is a built out module just like those. And that lets us see what's going on across all of IPA. So, that lets us see what IPA calls work units. Those are running or completed process flows. So every time a process flow runs, a work unit gets created, and then in that work unit, all the metadata for that particular run of that process flow gets stored. And we can see all that through the process server administrator. So when we talk about being able to see all those metrics and kind of see that 30,000 foot look, we're doing that all through the process server administrator. We can hit that directly in the web through Mingle or the web UI. We can also hit it through the rich client, although most of the folks on this call, I'm sure, will know that the rich client is going away before too long. But the feature set's the same no matter which one you're looking at. Process server administrators also will do all of our service definitions and scheduling and things like that. So that's where a lot of the day-to-day operational stuff is going to happen. And then we've got the IPA in basket. This is very similar to the old school, V8, 9, 10 in baskets that were in S3 if you're coming from that environment. And basically every user or every group can have an in basket that they've got access to. And if a user action in a process flow kind of creates a stop gate waiting on a user to do something, that will go into a user's in basket. So if I'm a manager and somebody on my team has tried to hire somebody, but it needs my approval, this is going back to one of the examples Robert was talking about, that if we design the IPA, if we design the process flow to wait on a user action, that will show up in my in basket. And then I can go into that in basket and say, oh, okay, here's this work unit for a hire action. I approve, and I can click approve or reject right there, and that kicks it right back to the process flow to go do whatever we've designed into that flow for those different logic branches. And then the third piece is the Infor Process Designer client. A lot of us call this IPD, and this is a desktop tool that you need to download and install that is basically a drag and drop workflow editor. It's gone through a lot of iterations. It's been a little bit of a roller coaster for those of us who have been doing process flow development for a long time. But I think I speak for a lot of us when I say it's in a much better place now. It's pretty reliable. It's very easy to use, and actually, I think this next slide was kind of a good little look at it. But it's basically, we've got access in this middle section here to all these different activity nodes. And then we can drag and drop different activity nodes into what's called the canvas, and then make connections between those to order what the activity should look like in the flow. We can see the designer client as we go along and build a flow will automatically detect what it thinks could be potential errors, potential warnings. So it's sort of doing like an in-flight debugging before we even run anything. So it makes it really easy for us to catch things at the beginning if we're maybe forgetting to define something, or we're calling a variable that doesn't exist or something like that. And then in each activity node, we can look at these properties, and each one is going to be a little bit different depending on what's going on in that activity node. But in there, we can define all the different configuration parameters that apply to that particular activity node. So even just at this first glance, and we're not looking at any live workflow here, but this is pretty easy to wrap your head around, right? It's drag and drop. The connection concepts are pretty straightforward. The configuration concepts are pretty straightforward. We don't necessarily need to know a whole programming language here to be able to make really good use of this. We just kind of need to be able to see in our heads or on paper, what does this workflow supposed to look like? What is each step in this workflow supposed to do? And then how does that translate into IPA? So that's the process designer client. And those three are really the three kind of key concepts that live inside of that IPA processing server inside of your landmark. I miss anything there, Robert? Robert, you're on mute, or I put you to sleep.
To sleep, but I'll unmute myself. And I don't want to take all of that is 100% correct, but I don't want it to say that that's the only thing in there, right? So all of our connections to systems, we talked about like being able to connect via SFTP, that lives within our process servers. So me being able to go out and look at how work units are processing, that lives within process server, right? So there is more to, in addition, I mean, no, just those three, that's a really high level of those three, but all of it is encompassed in process server. It all runs within that process server engine and of itself. So if I'm making connections, if I'm checking variables, if I'm looking at work units, if I'm doing all of that, it all lives in the process server in engine itself, and I can go to it from within the application. So it gives me the ability to reach out, but also to gain access to that, it's all in the same place. So I'm not going out to all these different places to get to it. I'm going to the same place. And I guess that's just what I wanted to call out.
No, and that's actually a really good point that I think we miss some of the times when we talk about kind of the introductory stuff. But this gets a little bit into the weeds. But for those of you who already have a decent familiarity with the landmark environment and know how the data in there is structured, and this is the same for the applications too, and that idea of the business class. So, basically a table, but with some extra code and logic and things like that built on top of it. All of this IPA stuff is kept in business classes too. So if you're already familiar with navigating around business classes in the application, it's no different in IPA. Now, there's fewer reasons for us to need to get into the business classes in IPA, but there are some really compelling things that we can do in process flow, leveraging some of that stuff. And because it's structured the same way as the application, all of that data is really easy to get to, and we can get to it all from process flow. So You know, if you want to get kind of inception level meta here, you can design process flows that sort of monitor themselves as they go along, because they can be reading some of that data from those business classes just like they would be reading that data from business classes on the application side. And that goes for not just the work unit metrics, but just like Robert said, also for all that configuration stuff. When we configure, how do we connect to an FTP server, or what credentials do we use, or what URL do we use to make a particular web service call? All those are in business classes. And at that business class level, at this process server administrator level, we can also define a lot of global variables that we can use later on. And there's a lot of good shortcuts that we can leverage if we want to, built into that process server level. And it's all in there in the application, and it's all structured exactly like the application. It's all the same runtime environment. That's a big change from folks who are coming from V9 or V10 process flow, where process flow was essentially a completely different product that sort of ran with different servlet containers and was its own kind of self-contained thing. Now in V11, the application and IPA are sort of one and the same.
So I want to call out, we're going to talk about some commonly used nodes. So the way that we interact with IPD and the way we define what a process looks like is using these nodes. I'm going to call out, and here we have some of the commonly used ones, and I'm going to call some of these out. I want to call it, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. There are more nodes that are built within the system, and I will call out that Infor does add nodes. So this isn't an ending list. More nodes will get generated, and they'll make tweaks to ones that already exist. So this is an evolving, piece of Infor. It's a tool that we use with Infor. It's evolving. It's not one they put out and then they just set it and forget it type mentality. There are additions that happen to these. There are, things that have made our lives more easier as we move through the iterations of, processing within you. So the start and end, every time you do, you'll notice on the screenshot we had before, there was a start and end. Anytime you create a new process, that start and end shows up. So you don't have to add those, they're already there for you. So you'll notice on the screenshot here, we have a start and end. Those will show for you. You can't get rid of them. All of our processes start, all of them end. So we need to have them on there. Infor just did it for us when we create new ones. If we go into kind of working with data itself, we have data iteration via the data iterator node. It allows us to iterate or process through pieces of information, break it up if we need to. If we want to write to or pull from a file, we have the file access or FTP, which SFTP. If we need to send data out or pull data in to our environment, that's the node we're going to utilize. Message Builder is going to give us the ability to kind of collect up. So if I'm writing something out to, let's say, a file, and I want that file layout to look a specific way, Message Builder is a way for me to do that. I can line up my variables in a specific way, so that way when I write the data out from that variable, it actually writes out the way that I want to. If I want to send some sort of notification, so I have the ability with an IP to send emails. So there are a couple others, different SMS and social functionality, but the biggest one we use is email notification. I can utilize the system to grab who I'm sending it to, what their email address is defined within the system. I can use the system to my advantage that way to find out what that looks like, and then let them know based off of data elements that live within the flow in addition to other pieces of information. And then as far as controlling, so if I want to take a piece of information from like a landmark transaction, which we're going to talk to in a second, and I want to assign that to a variable, or if I want to do some JavaScript pieces, that's where my assign node is going to come into place. My branch node, this is my else if type scenarios. If I have 4 different scenarios and it's going to process differently based off those 4 scenarios, that's where my branch comes into place. So I can go based off this piece of information, I can go one way, another piece of information, I can go a different way, and then I can come back into my process. And then if I need to run a secondary process, I know this is going to run for, let's say, 4 different flows, I can actually create sub-processes. So I can come out of my parent into my sub, process it, and then come back into my parent, and I can run that as almost like a function for the people who are familiar with coding. And then wait, I love this one. It's literally to wait. So I can define out how much time I needed to wait, but it allows me the ability to kind of pause my workflow processing. And this definitely does have some usability of waiting for something to complete or waiting for, some other secondary process to run. I've even used this over like a weekend span of time to kind of pause processing and then continue to work, when it starts back up on the business. And then we talked a bit about having some different connections. So we have some web, XML, and JSON functionality with an IPA that gives us some of that ability to convert, to run, to parse, to work with XML strings, and, using those different, some of the newer technologies that are being utilized out in the marketplace. And then one of the things we talked about was controls, right? So if I want to send work to someone in order for them to interact with it, that's a user action, it's an interaction. I wanted to send to a supervisor and I want that supervisor to approve this action. I'm using the system to identify who that person is, and then I'm having the flow send it to their inbox or that functionality in order for them to interact with the system for it to continue processing. I have a lot of different variables in there. So I have my HRTM user action, which allows me to use my supervisor structure versus my user action. If I know specifically who I need to reach out to, I can then just send it straight to that person without going through a supervisor structure. And then the landmark node set. So I have a landmark transaction node, a landmark administrator node. The landmark transaction node is one of, I would call one of the most powerful nodes that there is when it comes to IPA. It's my ability to look into the landmark runtime area. So I can look at to what Jared was talking about, the different business classes. I can look in the different pieces of the suite. So HR versus absence, versus another one's escaped me, but the different are PFI. We're talking about reaching in to process, right? If I need to get some of those pieces, I can select my module, I can select my business class, and I can get to the different actions, whether it's finding something, updating something, creating something. IPA allows me the ability to do that. And then I'll just do a quick plug. So Jared, correct me if I'm wrong, our second presentation is on the landmark transaction node. We go pretty in depth into, using that node, looking at that node, and what are some of the real strong pieces related to that node in and of itself. And then we have Infor Loston. So anyone who is currently doing, payroll processing on the S3 side and single tenant or on-prem, I do have my LSF related nodes. I can go into security over there and go into Awesome System Foundation and V10, and I can look and do and interact with that system as well from V11 IPA. So it allows me the ability to kind of do work in both areas when I know I need to. And then ION is our new messaging. So we have ION across the system. So user master bots for those people who are processing, security and user setup within the V11 environment. So I have my ability to interact with ION as well. And then, like I said before, this isn't an exhaustive list, and it is changing. So new stuff gets added. Jared, anything additional?
I would just say, I think this is, we've done this presentation a bunch of times. We've talked to a bunch of clients about IPA using a lot of this material. And I think this is my favorite slide because when you first look at this, it seems like a lot. There's just like an explosion of like bubblegum flavor colors coming at you, right? But what this shows is that, there's no one way to do something in IPA. There's all of these different tools, and there's a million different ways we could make a process to achieve whatever goal we're looking at, right? Even if we look at something as simple as notification, we can use, we can use the actual email notification, but you kind of mentioned this real quick, but also, and not shown here, is that there's SMS notification. So we can connect a third-party SMS provider to be able to send out notifications that way. We can use different social channels to do that as well. There's the user interaction. So this goes back to like pushing a notification to somebody's in basket. So when they go into V11, they see their in basket, they see they've got something waiting in there, they can go in there and do that. Or ION, there's ION as well. And we can leverage that to send notifications through the Infor OS Mingle homepage for those folks who are running or either multi-tenant or single tenant or on-premise, but running Infor OS. So even just something as simple as letting a person know that they've got some task waiting for them. There's a bunch of different ways we can do it, and we can, kind of think about. We can look at all the different tools and kind of think about, okay, for us specifically, what is the best way for us to do this? And we see a ton of stuff on here, and I think that sometimes it can look a little bit overwhelming. And Robert, you said a couple times this is not exhaustive. This is just us kind of picking up what we think are really the most important. But really, we use a lot of data iterator, we use a lot of the branches, we use a lot of transaction. That makes up the bulk of the activity nodes, I bet, that our developers use, because those are the heavy lifters, right? Of course, we're going to use some web service stuff. Of course, stuff's hitting in baskets. Of course, we're FTPing things, but the heavy lifting is happening really just in a couple. So even if we, cut this canvas in half, there's still a ton of power in some of these transaction nodes. And Robert, just to reiterate what you said about that landmark transaction node, this guy down here, definitely go look up part 2 of Beginner Guide to IPA series, because there is a lot in there. There's a lot of good information. That tool is really, really powerful. And it's a good example of, why we might use the landmark transaction node instead of maybe the SQL transaction node, right? Because some people that are coming from V9 or V10 might say, well, hey, how I get at data in the application is I go to a SQL node and I go hit that table. Well, if you're on premise in V11, you can still do that. But if you're multi-tenant, you no longer have access to the SQL query tool anymore, or at least not for hitting Infor data, not your application data in the multi-tenant cloud. And of course, there's great reasons for that, right? You're in the multi-tenant meaning there are multiple tenants in there with you, so you're sharing some resources. So Infor naturally has to put up some walls around that. But that's where that landmark transaction node comes in. It is really powerful. And it's even in that case, it's just in the Infor Process Designer tool, but that properties pane, it brings up a whole builder wizard that lets you really easily go through all the business classes that are available to you, all the data elements in those business classes, how you want to relate them, how you want to filter them, and it's all just point and click. So it's really, really powerful in that way, and it almost so much so that you really just have to have some application familiarity to be able to get in there and do some kind of basic stuff. You really don't have to have a ton of IPA experience to get in here and start working. Obviously, you can see with some of these in here, these can get really, really, really complex. And even some of these ones that are really simple, the assign node and things like that, we can load up a lot of JavaScript in there, a lot of complex JavaScript to make that node, that kind of humble assign node, do some really, really impressive things. So there's a huge, very high ceiling here for the complexity, but there's really, really low barriers to entry. And that's because Infor has done so much work to make some of these tools like the landmark transaction node really easy to get at for a beginner.
So we're going to go a bit from the presentation and kind of do some quick looking in IPD itself, and then we're going to do a quick into Mingle. So I'm actually going to open up IPD. Can you confirm that you can see that, Jared?
I can. It looks good.
Excellent. So put together a real kind of quick flow. These can very well flows look just as simple, but they can also get pretty complex to where you need a really large, pretty large screen. You're going to be scrolling all over the place. So if I talk about requisition approval, that usually ends up getting pretty big. We didn't want to go into that in depth and scare too many people off. So we put this simple one together where, we had our start and then we had our end, right? We talked about that shows up for us. Here's our landmark transaction node. I'm actually going out and I'm gathering a couple pieces of information from within the HR module and the employee business class. And then when I go to my assign, I just want to kind of do some assignments based off my landmark transaction node. And then I want to interact. So I then want to send this to someone, and I want them to then have it in their in basket and tell me what to do. So this goes out based off our user action node. And you'll notice over here, we're sending this to an intro IPA task. And we're going to look at that in just a second. So once I've sent this to that task, my flow then sits and waits. It's waiting for some sort of action back to it to tell it what to do. And then once I come back, my two options are approve or not approve. And then it's going to send off a notification based off of those two actions. So not too crazy, but does utilize some of the same pieces that we've already talked about today. And then if we go out to Mingle, Jared, can you confirm you can see that?
Yep.
So we're over in GHR. I've set my role to process server administrator, and I'm going to head over here under configuration and go under my user configuration, and I'm going to look at my tasks, because that's where I'm going to see that intro IPA. We just saw that in the flow that I'm routing work to intro IPA. And then based off of the task I have a certain number of people. Right now, Jared and myself are set up to where we can interact with that task. So the system does come built with already defined tasks. So you don't technically have to build some unless you're putting your own process in place and you want to define your own group. And that's what we did here. We created an intro IPA task group, and then we took two of our users that we have in the system and we tied them to that group. This then takes us to how do I interact with that? So up here in your top left, you're going to have my in basket. So my in basket is going to contain the work that needs to be interacted with. I'm going to have my task at the top. Everyone has their own, if they have in basket, their C-right security, which you'll need, and then you'll have any additional ones that you're tied into. Because I'm assigned intro IPA, my task is aligned here at the top, and then I would see any work that then comes into that task for approvals. And I'll get a little notification up here. You'll see this little red dot up here that is going away and coming back. If I have work in my in basket, I'm going to get notified that I have that with that flipped on in my system. So I'll know whether I have something I need to interact with. Now, one of the things that we've been talking about is we can get work to people in different ways. So we're going to talk a bit about triggering. So we have quite a few ways that work can be triggered in of itself. There's something called a file channel. If I want to have a flow kick off when a file shows up, I can create this file listener that looks in a specific file location for a specific file name or wildcarded file names. And when that file shows up, I can then automatically kick off my process. So if I'm getting data from another third party or I'm getting data from somewhere that is a flat file related format, I can put a listener on a location and I can have my process kick off when that shows up, and I can set it for any number of minutes, hours, whatever time frame I want to continue to look for that. We have interactions from kicking actions off. So if I'm a manager, I'm an administrator, I'm looking at an employee record and I want to change a pay rate, if I want to do a transfer and I want it related to that employee, I have that menu list so I can trigger it straight from the application itself in various places. And then there's scheduling. I can schedule a process to run. If I need to go look for a set of employees for a specific type, and I want to let someone know that these people are in there, or if I have some sort of maintenance I want to do on employee records, I can search for who those employees are. I can make those changes, and I can notify someone that these are the changes made. So I have, and there's more than that. I'm just talking on three of the highest, kind of the most popular ways that we find triggering workflows to work within the system itself. Jared, anything additional?
Well, and don't forget, we kind of, you talked around this just a little bit, but, I think everybody can see here, we're looking at what looks just exactly like the application menus for GHR or FSM. So again, this is a native tool. It's not some other product we've got to go jump to some other server for. This is just built right in line in your Landmark runtime environment with your other applications. And because of that, we can leverage things like configuration console. So we can get really into the weeds with some of that stuff, but at a very high level, I think a lot of folks on this call know we can use Configuration Console to customize some of the, customize business classes, customize some of the logic behind those business classes, customize what some of the menus and these screens look like. Well, with those same abilities, we can add options to trigger process flows with certain, buttons or menus on these screens, or, contain or link a process flow to a certain configuration console event happening. We can use process flow to leverage custom business classes and custom data elements that we used configuration console to create, right? So because of how tightly bound up in the kind of core landmark runtime functionality IPA is, we can use all those other landmark tools to kind of bring things together and get a really powerful integration or workflow solution using that. And that that could use the in-basket, that could use a custom menu item on a particular screen. Robert, like you said, say we're an HR generalist, we're searching for an employee, and there is no automated option for let's say something like relocate employee, right? If they've got to move from their office in Colorado to their office in Arizona, right? We could use Configuration Console to sort of create what that action should be on the back, and then use IPA to actually, be the workflow that goes and does those changes when it's triggered by Configuration Console. So, we can use these different customization features in Landmark to do some really powerful things when we combine them.
Great point, Jared. I think it really is embracing the power of being in the Landmark runtime environment, from the configuration console to configure the system the way that I need it to, even if it doesn't necessarily relate to, Infor specific processing, but it's getting data in or out. My process definitions. So the flow we looked at, I can go straight over here to process definitions and my user defined processes. And here's my flow. It's the definition of that flow sitting in my system for it to interact and run from my work units, for me to make modifications to this, for me to look at the different versions of it that I have within the system. So it all fits in Mingle. I'm going to it based off my security that I have, and I'm interacting between my resource record to configuration console to configuring it to the definitions I have here. All those pieces are tied into this single system, and it makes it very powerful to be able to utilize and interact within this single runtime environment.
So, Robert, I'm going to take control again here.
Yes, please.
And so, it's funny. I think, Robert, every time you and I sit together before one of these presentations, we think, are we going to have enough stuff to talk about? Are we going to be able to fill it up? And then now we're about out of time. And I think we always find more stuff to talk about here. And the intro one, this part one, sometimes feels like it's the hardest, because we know there is so much ground to be covered, and we kind of think, well, but let's talk about this. Let's talk about this too. So
Definitely.
I think we can probably kind of wrap it up there. That's we've kind of walked through really high level all these different pieces that make up IPA. We've tried to keep it. I know Robert and I both have a tendency to jump in the weeds a little bit, but we've got this high level look at how does IPA fit into this? What are some of the things that we can do with IPA? And maybe how even do we get started here? So we'll go take some questions now, but certainly I recommend checking out part 2 and part 3 on our YouTube channel and the website, and certainly keep your eyes peeled. I'm sure there will be a part 4 or 5, so on and so forth. So with that, any questions? Dave, I don't know if you were watching the chat. I didn't see anything through the chat, but we can certainly take questions there as well.
Yeah, I did not. There were no questions in the chat. So.
Okay, sounds good. Well then, I'll turn it over to you, Dave.
All right, thanks. If you could go to the next screen. All right. Hey, great session, guys. That was really good. Thanks for everybody for joining today. We really appreciate you taking the time on a Friday to join us, and hopefully we got some good information to you. If you enjoyed today's webinars or have been, participated in past ones, we're actually having a new webinar series that begins for the month of July. Please look for notifications over social media and out on our website. And registration would be the same way you register for this one. Either go to our website or send molly.velasco@balesllc.com an email, and we'll get you signed up. And as a closing thought, we wanted you to be aware of our Coffee with Consultants offering. If you have any questions about what you saw today or any questions related to the Infor products that you own, please reach out to us via our website. We'll connect you with a consultant who will spend a half an hour with you at no charge over coffee, tea, or whatever your preferred beverage is, and they'll answer any questions that you have related to anything in your Infor system. It's a good opportunity to tap into the knowledge that our team has at no cost. I hope everybody has a good rest of your day and a great weekend, and thank you again for joining.
Thanks, everybody.